So thank you, everybody, for joining. I understand we've got people from North America, from Europe, from Asia. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you wherever you are. So I'll be taking you through the first bit, some analysis of what we see are trends within the pharmaceutical industry, and what we see as the impact on the supply chain. Roddy will then present much more around what he sees in terms of people, process, and technology requirements to be able to address the changes in the supply chain. And then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the technology we provide that helps people accommodate these changes. So I've been around supply chain for many years, very often within the vendor community, but also within the management consultancy community, and some period earlier in my life actually in industry. Roddy Martin has been with Accenture some years, but he was also with AMR Research for many years, leading their CPG and pharmaceutical practice, and he's also been in industry for many years, particularly in the brewing industry, so he comes with a wealth of on-hand experience. So what is it that we see as key trends within the pharmaceutical industry? Most certainly, I give you a highlight at this level and then go through some more detail as we go through some additional slides. But we do see some new regulations, particularly for DCA, which was passed by the FDA recently, which the impact of that is drug shortage reporting requirement throughout the network, with increasing penalties, with the amount or the lack of lead time that the FDA has in terms of those drug shortages. And we understand that Europe is going to piggyback rules on their side as well in terms of the drug shortage notification and penalties that come with that. Increased outsourcing, API, especially in small molecule, but we've seen a great deal of outsourcing also for packaging in large molecule, small molecule, across the entire spectrum, even including OTC. And we'll discuss a little bit about what we see as the issue there. Shift in treatment focus, which is actually very related to Fiducia, in the sense that people are going after orphan diseases, or what people refer to as orphan diseases. That means ones with a very small number of people around the world who suffer from these diseases. So moving away from broad spectrum treatments that have been the stable of many of the pharmaceutical industry for many, many years, into much more narrow spectrum treatments, which then add a great deal of complexity in terms of the demand and in terms of the supply chain. Distinct markets, most certainly everybody knows that even today there's a great deal of focus on the Western world with its much higher personal expenditure on health. But what's happening is, of course, there's a huge increase in the market availability in the emerging markets, China and India in particular, but also Indonesia and many of the other highly populated areas where the diseases are different, but also as those markets have gained in capabilities of personal expenditure, we've seen many of the traditional Western diseases, such as diabetes, begin to flare up, and this is, of course, providing a great deal of opportunity from a sales perspective, but also complexity from a supply chain perspective in delivering through into those large markets. Shorter patent protection, end of blockbuster period. We see many of the drugs that have been mainstays in the West now beginning to lose patent protection, and also challenges in some of the emerging markets about extending patents through formula changes. And as a consequence, we can see that the period in which pharmaceutical manufacturers are going to be able to reap a great deal of margin is diminishing, which is putting pressure on the whole discovery side of things. But the compounded effect of all of these is driving the need for supply chain transformation, and that is the key topic for today. So what is it that we're going to do in the supply chain to be able to cope with many of these industry trends in the pharmaceutical manufacturing space? So if I just go into some more depth on some of these areas, so if we see what's driving, or what has been the driver for DCA, is there's been this huge increase in drug shortages of 300% since 2005, many of them with short periods of notification. And if you look on the right-hand side, you then see that this has meant a markup of 650% often by great market vendors to be able to satisfy the shortfall. Of course, that puts tremendous pressure on any payment system within the pharmaceutical industry, whether that's more of a government-driven payment system such as in Europe or Canada, or more private-driven payment systems in the U.S. Nevertheless, there are big effects on the overall cost to the market. And if we look at the drug shortages, just in 2010, there were 178 and 251 in 2011, so big increase. And those numbers have just been going up. Now, something about the grey market side of things is, of course, we also seen a great deal of, shall we say, ineffective drug substitution, where people are actually using non-effective APIs, and in many cases, complete, in fact, drugs that are quite detrimental to people's health, in trying to satisfy this big increase in shortages. So all of these things are driving the FDA to say that what they need to have is much greater visibility across the supply chain, even to the extent of saying that you might be selling the drug, but if you buy an API from somebody else, then they have the right to go and inspect the API plants. So this is opening up a great deal of the need for end-to-end visibility across the entire network, and as well as the collaboration then from the OEMs or the brand owners who are then responsible to the FDA for getting this product to market. So it's definitely driving this need to have that entire network visibility across multiple tiers of outsourcing. Now, part of the FDA is also focusing on orphan drugs, FDCA. FDCA, the positive side of it is it's allowing people to accelerate the approval process for nominated drugs on their side, with the intent of actually increasing the number of orphan drugs on the market and reducing the burden of approval. But this is having a complicated effect on the portfolios. If we look at the sort of long tail analysis that we have up on the screen, then we can see how people typically within other industries are making an analysis of what is in the portfolio and what to prune from some of those niche products. But the problem is, as you go after orphan drugs, it puts pressure on the large volume items and increases the importance of the long tail and niche products. And the net effect is you get smaller revenues per product, per SKU. Your demand volatility goes up, and of course you have increased supply chain complexity, which all adds to increased supply chain costs. So this is driving a great deal of packaging component postponement and inventory visibility need, but a key aspect of the problem is that packaging is, of course, inside of the supply chain, as it were. It's not off to the end like API production. So as a consequence, all of a sudden, people are going through API in bulk, and then they lose complete visibility when it goes off to packaging and then comes out the other side, and they have to deal with distribution. So there's definitely this need to tie those different aspects of the supply chain together so that they have end-to-end network visibility. In all of this, of course, there's the aspect of innovation and discovery costs, which is a key aspect of any pharmaceutical industry, whether small molecule or large molecule. But as we can see from this Morgan Stanley study, while the number of molecules has been going down, the cost of actually discovering those molecules has been going up exponentially. So there's an enormous amount of pressure within the organization of being able to look at the operating margin, which includes, of course, the cost of goods sold and the efficiencies in the supply chain, to be able to drive greater capital utilization, and which then, of course, helps the discovery process by freeing up working capital in the supply chain. And then the last one that I really want to deal with in any level of detail here is around the outsourcing. Now, this study was done in 2010, so 3 years ago, where you can see that there was a great deal of API manufacturing, up to 55% increase of the API, but there's also some early drug discovery and API development clinical research on the left-hand side. But where we have seen since 2010 an increase, especially in packaging, is downstream. So when we're talking about dosage development, dosage manufacturing, and packaging in particular, with many of the Western companies going out into the emerging markets, they have tended to outsource the packaging for those markets in the local markets and add in this extra level of the complexity in the supply chain. So this is definitely driving internal and external cross-functional collaboration needs, where people now need to understand what packaging capabilities, what packaging capacity is available, and be able to direct that in the correct manner to satisfy market demands. So tremendous needs to improve there. With that, I'll hand over to Roddy.
Thanks, Trevor. So the way I would like to start this presentation on the stages of transformation of the life sciences industry is by just putting in place the idea that companies transform and different companies are at different stages of maturity. Now, the context of that is consumer goods companies are fairly advanced because for them the shelf and the consumer is well defined. Consumer electronics, the stages of maturity are based on end-to-end transformation from a supply perspective and the risks in a supply perspective. And obviously the opportunity for the life sciences industry is to transform around the idea that the driver is actually the patient. So the context and the framing up of the stages of maturity are, it's a 5-stage maturity model. Every company moves through each stages. Companies don't jump through stages. They may move through stages quickly because of a clear vision as to a desired outcome and a capability. Stage 1 is really reacting to problems. So in other words, no systemic approach to performance improvement, but the company tends to see a problem after it's happened and then react to it. Stage 2 is project-based problem solving. We see a lot of this around inventory, demand forecast accuracy, network optimization, etc. So stage 2 is project-based problem solving led by experts. Stage 3 is functional excellence. So it could be demand excellence, supply excellence, S&OP, as a process, quality excellence, manufacturing excellence, efficiency, etc. So this is a stage that's really enabled by a lot of IT systems. And then stage 4 is the first time we see end-to-end process capabilities, starting with the patient, the customer, the consumer, and then stage 5 is effectively value chain excellence. So value to all elements of the supply chain. Now, just to give you some benchmarking context, I have benchmarked 55 companies. The industry average is around a 2.4, which means most companies are still improving performance as a project, a set of projects. A lot of the consumer goods and consumer electronics companies are around stage 3. So, well-known computer manufacturers are in stage 3. Well-known consumer goods manufacturers in the Midwest are around stage 3, 3.5. Stage 4, only very few companies. So Unilever's in stage 4. In Asia, Procter & Gamble were the highest that I've seen at a 4.7. And then stage 5 is obviously more of an aspiration. So I think why the relevance, and that is that in the healthcare industry, most companies are in their own silos, are in stage 2.5 around projects. In other words, doing projects to improve performance of individual capabilities like inventory or demand forecast accuracy, product launch capabilities, etc. The industry leaders are a high 4, and those are the consumer goods companies that have really internalized and operationalized end-to-end supply chain. This is very relevant for control towers, by the way, because what you find is the control towers that one can find in the industry are support all 5 stages. It's much more difficult to get to stage 5 with an ERP system or just a set of planning systems, because obviously there's a lot of integration, there's global information. So stage 2, obviously in the project-based mode of performance improvement, a control tower provides visibility inside of the silo. Stage 3, a control tower provides visibility across multiple ERP systems. Stage 4 is where the control tower's value proposition really kicks in, because it's across multiple planning ERP systems, able to do simulations, what-if scenarios, advanced analytics. And so you find companies that are in stage 4 have already gone down the road of deploying visibility and analytics-based control tower capabilities. So this is a very important perspective, because especially in the healthcare industry, I think we're going to see this over the next couple of years. Now, has anybody done this? Well, Pfizer has been the first to publicly, in the press, write about their control tower strategy in the cloud in order to enable their global business. And that obviously makes sense, and I think this is what we're going to see a lot of in the future. Now, as I click my cursor, you will see that a line comes up between stage 3 and stage 4, and I think this is a really important point to make, and that is what got you to stage 3 with integrated systems, integrated data, and all the conventional sort of IT strategy initiatives like master data management is not going to get you to stage 4, because stage 1, 2, and 3 is largely what I would call inside out. In other words, from supply to the patient. What gets you from stage 3 to stage 4 is flipping from inside out to outside in. So therefore, in stage 4, the really dominant factor is the fact that it's patient-driven, it's end-to-end processes. So instead of it being, functional excellence silos in stage 3, it's now process excellence silos all the way from the patient back to supply. So a really, really important context to understand where the healthcare industry is. The healthcare industry, most of the contract manufacturers are in high stage 1s, in other words, bordering on stage 2. Most of the manufacturers, suppliers themselves are in stage 2. The hospitals are in stage 2 because they tend, and in fact the hospitals are probably a little more advanced because they tend to be at the patient interface. So they're close to a stage 3 than what most of the manufacturers are. But I think it's really important context to understand these stages. So I've spent a lot of time explaining in stage 4 what an end-to-end system looks like, and I've put up this model that we use at Accenture to describe the components of the end-to-end healthcare system, and obviously the market represents the patients, the patients, the hospitals, the users, clinics, etc., the actual market dynamics, and then as we go from left to right, you find the dark blue lines are the supplier organizations with distributors, where you've got the customer-facing processes like, for example, order and account management, integrated business planning, for example, sales and operations planning, and then an integrated product supply network being the global set of product supply sites delivering product, and then obviously suppliers and partners. So the key takeaway from this slide is that we're moving from a inside out or right to left, where we make product and then ship it into the market to be sold, to a left to a right, which is demand driven. In other words, where we're reading the marketplace, have the right amount of inventory at the right place at the right time, and then using that to plan what we need to supply. So it's a question of going from right to left or inside out to the patient, going to outside in, demand driven, or from the left to the right. And I think it's a very fundamental translation of business strategy. So, you may ask, well, what are the big challenges that companies have as they make this move? Well, the first one is changing the mental model of the organization. So for the first implication is, we all know the history of the traditional branded life sciences companies where 100, 200, even 300 days worth of inventory was the order of the day, and that was the way that risks were managed, is bringing those inventory levels down to much more realistic levels, as you heard Trevor talk about, the cost challenges, the working capital challenges on the industry, and the only way that you can really do that is better demand forecast, better demand planning, better collaboration between the suppliers, better information visibility, which is exactly where the control tower message plays in across the end-to-end system. So this is the context of the end-to-end supply chain, demand-driven, and by the way, a number of the consumer electronics and consumer goods manufacturers are already using this model. If you look at the research we did at AMR a number of years back, now Gattorna, you will see that this is the fundamental underpinning principle in the demand-driven model. So again, just to highlight the base capabilities and to accentuate the role of the control tower, and that is going from left to right, and now adding big data. So I think over what we're going to see, as you heard in my comment section in Trevor's presentation, as we see insights from big data starting to impact on the supply chain from the left to the right, our core capabilities as a manufacturing healthcare supply system is market demand sensing and translation and demand shaping, launching products, for example, sufficiency and demand supply planning, which is effectively sales and operations planning, and then a reliable, compliant supply system. So those are the real core capabilities that are embodied in the transformation from an inside-out supply-driven system to an outside-in demand-driven system. So if I move to the next slide, one of the big differences that are involved in this transformation, because it is transformational, those companies that have successfully embarked on the journey and made progress delivering business results on the journey, one of the characteristics is that the fact that they recognize this is a change management transformation. It is led by senior leadership. It does involve changes in the operating model of the business. But more fundamentally, it involves people, process, and technology. This is the characteristic of and a very fundamental one of moving from stage 3 to stage 4. It's not about people projects, example, organization, or process projects like demand forecast accuracy, collaborative planning, forecasting, replenishment, or technology projects like an ERP. In stage 4, those companies that have made that jump into stage 4 have combined people, process, and technology perspectives in their operating strategy. And I think this is very fundamental. In a company just simply cannot exist with silos of people, process, and technology projects in stage 4 and operate as an end-to-end supply chain. So I think that's really important. And the second point that I would also make as part of that is, if you look at the leaders in end-to-end transformation, the companies like, for example, SAB Miller, well on their way to that, operating as a global organization, DuPont, Procter & Gamble. These are all companies that have transformation centers of excellence, which are not only part-time manned, they're manned by specialists in the industry that are overseeing and communicating, working with the leadership team around the transformation. So that's a very fundamental enabler of this transformation. What you see up here in front of you is an important perspective on reducing complexity. So you also heard Trevor in his preamble around the industry talk about companies striving to reduce complexity in the way they operate. One of the big areas of complexity in going from inside out to outside in other words, to the patient versus reading market demand and sensing at the patient need and translating that back, is the idea that if we can do demand-driven segmentation to understand the 4 or 5 different characteristics of the supply chain. Now, this model comes from John Gattorna's book on supply chain management. John Gattorna used to work for Accenture. He's now a professor of supply chain at Macquarie University in Australia. His books on supply chain management are really insightful, and he came up with this idea of outside-in driven segmentation. And very simply, because there's multiple dimensions of segmentation, this particular model that he uses is based on 2 dimensions: relationship with the customer and predictability of demand. So you can imagine that in the top left-hand corner, you have a very tight relationship with the customer and very predictable demand. So, Coca-Cola or Pepsi or one of the more traditional consumer goods manufacturers who supply Walmart, tight relationship with Walmart, very predictable demand, seasonality, etc. That's a continuous replenishment. It could be a DSD operation, or it could be just simply a well-run continuous replenishment operation. But if you go across to the right-hand side of this picture, where you have a loose relationship with the customer and low predictability of demand. This could be a life sciences manufacturer who's just launched a new product, not sure whether the product is going to have the uptake that is desired. But obviously we have to be agile and very flexible in where we put inventory in the supply chain and how we manage that supply network. So I think the point here is that in a control tower sense, we can't assume that every single supply chain is simply about integrating everything from the hospital through the distributors all the way back to suppliers, and that involves, multiple integrations of planning systems and ERP systems. The control towers really kick into play in the fact that the reality is that we have 4 or 5 supply chains. One of them may be continuous replenishment, and another may be a more lean, cost-conscious supply chain. Another one of the supply chains may be a fully flexible supply chain simply because of the stage of product maturity. The overarching control tower provides us access to all of the information that we need to do the planning and the inventory visibility, the risk management that is involved in managing 4 or 5 different supply chains. So the key takeaway point here is that this is not about one supply chain. I think we've moved on from the understanding that we're trying to build one integrated supply chain to the point where we have 4 or 5 different supply chains, and in fact these are characterized by the demand that drives each of those supply chains. And that's very fundamental to the control tower value proposition. So if we look at the next slide, I want to pick on the subject of S&OP simply because S&OP is such a topical discussion in the industry around planning. This slide really epitomizes the S&OP challenge. So the context here is from left to right, so in other words, demand-driven. And what you see here is all the different stakeholders, key stakeholders in the sales and operations planning process. So, we have sales and marketing, who obviously trying to drive revenue. We have finance, who obviously looking at working capital. We have operations that are responsible for inventory and product availability. And then we obviously have the traditional elements of the supply chain being logistics and all those traditional functions. Well, the point is that there are many different systems that play across this. I mean, on the demand side, we've got systems that are account-focused and data models that are account-focused. On the right-hand side, we've got supply-side systems that are planning-focused, inventory-focused, materials, MRP-focused. And so this is where the real value of a control tower starts to kick in, because we're not looking at one region. If you look at Pfizer's publicly declared and written about strategy of control tower in the cloud, this is about a global end-to-end supply chain. And so therefore now we have different marketing systems. We have different marketing standards across different countries. We have different MRP systems. Some of our sites may be in Latin America, some of them may be in North America, some of them may be in Asia. The point is, it is a lifetime task to integrate all these systems and come up with an overarching integrated scenario. And this is where the value of a control tower really kicks in, whether it's a control tower, whether it's a control tower supporting, global shared services or managed services as Accenture has. This is really the start of the value proposition. Now, the point that I want to make, and that is that what that control tower effectively does is it provides a company with a decoupling layer. So the chief supply chain officer of a very big, well-known global industrial company said to me personally, he said, Roddy, my problem is that as I'm moving the supply chain through the various stages of maturity, 1 to 5, the one challenge I have is that different countries, different sites are at different stages of maturity, so therefore it's very difficult for me to deploy one system to fit everybody's maturity. Second of all, he said, as I move through these stages of maturity, it's really difficult for me to get the right information to support the development of the capabilities. And so we came to the conclusion that what was really needed was a decoupling layer of information that is process-based, preferably scenario-based. So you'll hear Trevor talking about how Kinaxis structures their control tower deployment around scenarios like sales and operations planning and inventory management, etc. But the key principle here is that the fact that there is a decoupling layer to separate the layers of transactional technology that we've put in place over the last years, but still enable these different levels of maturity and different stages of capability that are developing across the business. So one of the most important perspectives here to consider, and that is that what's very clear from this picture, or should be very clear, is that the control tower is not designed to replace all your existing systems. It doesn't mean to say that you've spent $1.5 billion or $2 billion on your ERP systems, that was all a wasted investment. Those systems are still running local operations. What the control tower and the decoupling layer does is it provides end-to-end overarching process visibility, analytics, simulation capabilities across all of those systems for visibility, for planning, for simulations, for what-if scenarios. So in other words, if I wanted to move production from one area, one country to another area, I'm able to assess those capabilities by running a simulation. So I think this is a very important perspective. Now, what I haven't spoken a lot about, and that is about big data, because ultimately, as big data capabilities, in other words, internal and external data, structured and unstructured data, as we mine that data for insights that give us patterns in the marketplace or patterns internally in the organization between functions, this decoupling layers are going to become even more important, because it is the one point at which we want the visibility to be able to make the trade-off decisions and to make changes to the plans as the place evolves. So going back to the original context that I used, where the supply chain is really built around this central nucleus of demand-side data, supply-side data, and now we have this decoupling layer that provides us visibility and analytics. Obviously, the injection of big data insights will be a significant challenge for companies. And I think that, what really excites me, I was recently on a webinar around the life sciences industry, and I was asked, what really excites you about the future of the life sciences industry or the transformation of the end-to-end system. And my comment was, the sort of experimentation that you're seeing with big data. Because I think we in a sense, in going from a very transactional, statistically data-driven environment of knowing what questions we always want to ask because we're largely internally focused, to a externally driven, market-driven, where we're taking many sources of comments, data about our products. For example, just social media feeds, analyzing them, and then understanding what is the question that we're trying to answer. So the fundamental difference here is between the relational model in an inside-out, which is designed to answer very specific metrics-based questions, to an outside-in, where we're trying to track trends in the marketplace and then operationalize them in the organization. I think this is where we're really going to see the value of control towers kick in, because it's about the latency and redundancy of information across the end-to-end system. Anyway, so next on the next slide, what I very quickly wanted to talk about, and that is, often I get asked by companies, the value proposition of a control tower at very low stages of maturity. What's the difference between just integrating my systems or a project management organization and the deployment of a control tower? And working with a big consumer goods company, one of the elements that I've realized is these companies that are really advanced in their way, in the way that they're changing the operating model, the mental model of the organization, building integrative improvement capabilities end to end. One of the things that characterizes these companies is the fact that they're so good at problem solving. So they've developed capabilities to solve problems across multiple silos in the business. So if you look at this slide, what you will probably recognize is the 5 or 6 silos that you have in terms of your strategic planning. So, you've got planning silo and planning excellence, innovation, marketing, end-to-end supply chain capabilities. The problem is that most companies get stuck in these silos, and that's why they find it very difficult to progress beyond stage 3, because they tend to be driving functional excellence. If you go and look at those companies, like the Procter & Gamble is a very good example, who are, up in the 4s, or Unilever up in the 4s, what characterizes these companies is that they recognize how these various silos interact with each other. So, they have end-to-end value stream maps that embody technology, in other words, information technology, also process improvements, but they know they've mapped out the value streams for the organization. And this is one of the fundamental enablers to move beyond stage 2 and 3, which are project and functional excellence focused, into a stage 4 to 5, which is end-to-end process. It's not a trivial change in the mental and operating model of the business. So if we go on to the next slide, just to illustrate the point and why this is, I made the point earlier about the importance of a center of excellence. Just to illustrate this, and it's kind of amusing whenever I present the slide, somebody looks at all of these bars and says, oh yeah, I recognize those are all the projects that we're busy with in our organization. And so I've brought a number of concepts that I've presented in this presentation together in the slides. On the y-axis, you'll see performance-based measurements. In other words, so this could be stockouts if you're in a consumer goods company. So you will see that at the current picture on the y-axis, on the right-hand side, you'll see stockout performance is 20%. On the x-axis, what you see is practice adherence and projects. Now, what this picture tells you is that there are a number of projects running in the organization dealing with IT or change management, inventory management, perfect order performance, etc. But what we don't necessarily see in a PMO, project management organization-based approach to performance improvement is that there's actually one lowest common denominator that's effectively holding back us leveraging investments. So just as context and to add a bit of color, I often hear from C-level leadership teams that all the projects are performing, but why can't we see the results in the business results? Well, the net is, if you go into these companies like the DuPonts and Procter & Gamble's, you will find that they're continually looking out of these centers of excellence for the lowest common denominator that's constraining business performance. So in this case, it happens to be change management. So teamwork and change management as a sort of almost a cultural change management initiative. Well, what happens is as you address that initiative, what you find is as you improve teamwork and change management, you get the visibility and the performance from each of those other projects. And this could change the stock up performance from 20% to 10%. So suddenly, my IT systems that were being constrained by change management and teamwork, or my inventory optimization, or my perfect order performance. So now I start to see improvement and returns from each of those projects. Well, the reality is that what's just happened is that we've now moved the lowest common denominator to a new point. So this is where the Center of Excellence plays such a key role, and a control tower providing information visibility across all of these various projects and all of these various functions in the business is so critical. And this process carries on. So, the point that I made at the beginning is this is a journey. It's underpinned by a center of excellence. It's enabled by an overarching control tower that looks at performance in many different systems, many different functions, many different global parts of the business, but it's basically making all of this visible. So this is a very important point, and I would say that this capability, understanding this capability, driving these developments is really the key to moving from a stage 3 functional excellence, which is project-orientated, to stage 4, which is end-to-end process-orientated, is really fundamental, and why a control tower supporting global shared services or global managed services is so fundamental to seeing the end-to-end value in the business of this entire equation. So on that note, I will hand over to Trevor, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
So I just wanted to go very quickly through components of a control tower. I'm going to flash through these slides so we have lots of time to have a discussion at the end. So please start posting your questions. We'd love to have a lively Q&A session at the end. So a key aspect of what I want to bring on as a solution vendor is we do recognize that a control tower is a capability. People and process capabilities are really important in all of this. Software is an enabler that supports that, but you do need to go through some level of transformation to get to these higher levels of capability. It's not simply a matter about installing some software to do that. But nevertheless, from a technical perspective, it is about unifying the information and operational KPIs in a single location so that you can exercise the information across your organization and, in fact, even outside of your organization. And it unifies and binds the cross-functional process into a single place and, in fact, promotes the whole concept of the center of excellence. Because even if you do not get to the stage of having a physical center of excellence where people are co-located, at least from a technical perspective, you have the people working off the same data and you have a virtual center of excellence. But another absolutely key aspect of it is that it's a what-if simulation hub for operational functions, so that we all know that when you make a demand change, there's some impact on inventory, there's some impact on distribution, there's some impact on capacity, there's some impact on procurement. So the key question is, how quickly can you know that, and how quickly can you understand what the financial and operational impacts are? And as importantly, how quickly is it that you get to know who you need to talk to within those organizations, so that you find the person who is responsible and bring those people together to resolve a problem that has been created. And the key point that comes up, and Roddy did mention Jim Cafone, and he said this in a keynote presentation in Gattorna Supply Chain Management Conference in 2012, is that ERP is great if you only need to talk to yourself. In other words, that's the inside-out perspective. That's taking it from your organization and looking outside how that then deals with market, to back to the other side, of the outside in. But who can afford to do that in today's world? So Jim is very much focusing on the aspect that the market is driving everybody to an outside-in perspective, and we need to have the process and technology to be able to deal with that. And if you look at the limitations of existing technology, and of course this is across a network where you might be working with different people who are producing your API, doing packaging, or doing some level of distribution, then invariably you're going to have a mixture of planning systems across the whole network. And as a consequence, you have all sorts of integration points. And fundamentally, what is connecting everybody together is a whole bunch of Excel that's been emailed around the world, and we all know how quickly Excel and the information in it gets outdated and inconsistent with what the downstream or the underlying systems are saying. So the net effect is you get incomplete global representation, you get limited or functional excellence, and you get embedded decision latency because of the time it takes to get all of this information shifted around the network. What we promote is the idea is that you bring this all into a control tower, you bring in your data, codified strategies and policies, all of that information rolled up, so that you've got the center of excellence that actually is coordinating the operations across the entire network, whether inside your physical organization or external to that, but definitely across the functions in your physical organization. And what you end up then is global visibility, agility, and alignment across all of the functions, end-to-end process enablement, and definitely fast and accurate decisions. Being able to reduce that, and that's a key aspect of what we talk about, knowing sooner and acting faster. Now, how people make decisions and how their supply chains are organized, etc., can be encapsulated by this concept of the Sinofan framework, which is talking about simple processes on the bottom right where coordination is required, to complex situations where cooperation is required, to complex where collaboration is required, and we would add in chaotic is you need some response management capability. And if you look largely at the kind of solutions or approaches that can solve each of these different areas, of course this is not a direct match between the complicated APS and the complex and control tower, but it's a rough correlation between those things. Then what we believe is our solution provides you that virtual war room that spans all of those decision quadrants, including the war room aspect for doing response management in times of uncertainty or great change within your supply chain. We do believe in concurrent planning across functions as a central aspect of any control tower, but we also promote the idea of consequence evaluation alerting. When something happens that has an effect on the rest of the supply chain, the time it takes you to understand what the effect is and who's responsible is key to the cost you're going to incur in being able to correct that problem. So very much promoting the idea of getting that information through very quickly, but then bringing those people together who need to work together to resolve that issue into a central location. I don't mean physical, but virtual central location where they're all sharing the same information, creating scenarios to understand how they're going to resolve the problem, comparing those scenarios side by side to be able to understand the best course of action. And this is, we encapsulate in the idea of plan plus monitor plus respond. So it is this that provides you the breakthrough in a control tower, not just the core planning capability, but all of the other aspects of bringing the people together into a collaborative process so that they can decide on the best way through. Very quickly, the aspects that are required are representation, visualization, and orchestration, because if you don't have all of the data that represents your network, then you're, of course, going to have some blind spots. So you need to be able to bring all of that together, including the users in the network and their responsibilities within it. Visualization, you need to understand what that actually means and be able to compare your different scenarios and dive to the information that is important very quickly. And orchestration is all about getting the organization or getting the people necessary to work together, from alerting them that they need to participate, to managing a process flow, to automating some of those aspects, and also providing mobile connection into the whole process so that they can have instant access to at least the alerts and then decide how they're going to respond in a more meaningful manner. So from a pharmaceutical perspective, key things that we see as a need for concurrent planning across business issues is jurisdictional control of being able to understand what you need to sell to which market, where the demand is coming from, and being able to orchestrate all of the planning through that, including using outsourced packaging CMOs in particular markets, creating or using particular factories to produce the API. All of that management is really important of being able to respect that regulatory needs during the planning. Segmentation coupled with postponement and cost to serve analysis to be able to understand how much you're going to actually deal with in the emerging markets where it's much more direct sell rather than through the Western markets, particularly the U.S., where it's much of the distribution is through distribution partners. So being able to do all of that segmentation and understand it. Risk evaluation and recovery, really being able to understand where those shortages are and what you're going to be able to do about them, whether you can redirect API from one market to another in order to be able to satisfy or reduce the penalties in a particular market. Because the discovery process is so important, and because the emerging markets are becoming so important as a market driver or revenue driver for organizations, is the collaborative launch management of bringing clinical, regulatory, and commercial together to be able to understand when a commercial should start producing. Because of such long lead times within the pharmaceutical supply chain, that is a critical aspect to manage the risk associated with planning too early and therefore being exposed to expiry risk, or planning too late and therefore not being able to capture as much of the market as possible. And we see expiry management as a key aspect, but also consensus demand planning across the affiliates and countries using different units of measure and currencies have been able to translate all of that back into your manufacturing organization under a common unit of measure so that they're able to orchestrate that very well. And then, of course, in the longer term, the supply and capacity planning have been able to balance that across the entire network. But with that, rushing through, trying to leave some time for Q&A. Roddy, I'd love you to participate very quickly in this area. And really, Roddy, if I can start off, given that you weren't able to explain some of this in your own slides, what is it that you see as core to the decoupling layer provided by a control tower that separates it out from the traditional planning and execution systems?
Yeah, and I think that's a very relevant question. So point number one, just to accentuate a couple of items or points that I would have liked to have made if I'd done the front end of the presentation. Number one, I think the importance is that companies have invested hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars in ERP and planning systems over let's say the last 10 years. The whole idea of a control tower is not to replace those. Obviously, a control tower picks up some of the functionality in an integrated process sense that you would normally do if you just integrated your existing system. So point number one is it's not a replacement of your existing IT infrastructure. Second of all, it goes way beyond the boundaries of your existing organization into systems that are, in suppliers, in distributors, and in the marketplace. And you see this very clearly if you look at the strategy that's been laid out by Pfizer, and they've publicly written about it, a couple of press articles on Pfizer's control tower strategy in the cloud. So the point is, this allows us to build a information process integration across literally the end-to-end supply chain, all the way from the patient, the hospital, the clinic, through the distributors, all the way back through manufacturing to product supply. That's a really important factor. And Laura in the webinar I did with her yesterday, Laura Cicera, she said, what's the one element of the end-to-end healthcare system that really excites you? And I think that for the first time, we're seeing kinds of technologies like control towers and Kinaxis, the cloud, that allows us to do that information-based process integration across the end-to-end system. And then lastly, this is a massive transformational effort. One of the elements that I think that most companies underestimate, and that is this outside-in or demand-driven, patient-driven end-to-end healthcare system requires a different mental model, a different operating model for the business. Most of our companies operate as inside-out supply chains. In other words, we make product and we ship them. They go and sit in distributors, or they go and sit in the supply chain, and that's, we manage risks by in a sense stockpiling inventory. Excuse me. And I think that the real opportunity here, and I see one of the questions that John asked was, is the information being shared? And I think that now that we are entering into this big data, cloud-based control towers that are able to connect and, as Trevor put it, create a sort of a decoupling, information-based decoupling layer across all systems that allow us to visualize, also allow us to plan, because control towers have this capability of being able to run planning algorithms across multiple planning systems based on actual information that's sitting in the local planning application. Could be a advanced planning and scheduling system. So I think that we're in early days of seeing control towers in life sciences and in the healthcare system. The consumer electronics space has largely been using control towers for a number of years because they're so supplier dependent. One small component can mean that you can't ship a massively expensive piece of military hardware, and so therefore supply visibility, supply risk management against very complex bills of materials is where the consumer electronics or the high-tech electronics space has been using control towers for a number of years. So I think that the key idea of the decoupling layer is, number one, it's overarching. Number two, it's always on and always connected. In other words, it's taking, not on a batch basis, it's taking information and data from all the multiple ERP systems distributed globally and also planning systems distributed globally and running it against the data model that Trevor explained to you as being the core of a control tower. So these process scenarios, for example, sales and operations planning or inventory management, even capacity management, these are process scenarios that have been built into this decoupling layer process-based scenario and using actual live data from all the various systems on a global basis. And I think this is an absolute breakthrough. I think this is what's been holding all of us back from really being able to build an outside-in demand-driven supply chain. Trevor, any other points to raise?
Yes, in fact, I did want to deal with John's one question here, which is stricter pricing policies and access restrictions are largely decreasing demand and also making demand more difficult to predict, especially leading up to launch. How can this be addressed? So, John, I think that is one of the key things that a control tower does address, because I don't know that predictability can be increased and the demand accuracy or forecast accuracy can be improved. So the key aspect then is how quickly can you understand what true demand is and translate that across multiple trading partners into a supply response. So it's, definitely the key aspects of knowing sooner and acting faster are encapsulated in your question. But it's the key is described by Roddy is how can you now translate that across these multiple organizations and solutions that you've got underneath you, rather than relying on overnight EDIs to propagate this message up the supply chain, which is far too long to be able to affect any change and respond effectively to the demand change that you're seeing. So it's not about reducing that variability, it's about absorbing it, is what a control tower is all about.
Yeah, and okay. So Trevor, let me add to that, and just to talk to more of the answer to the question that John asked. So stricter pricing policies, and you raised the point about the importance of demand visibility. So I think that this is exactly the challenge that we're all facing as we build an end-to-end healthcare value chain, and that is the lack of visibility. So it always amazed me that even with 100 days worth of inventory and more, life sciences companies still stock out of product or have the wrong product at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so I think the importance of demand visibility and putting inventory in the right place in an optimized inventory level that allows us to manage cash flows and working capital more closely. So I think the reality is there will be stricter pricing policies, and the FDA will impose tighter regulations on visibility and product availability, etc. And so therefore, that's driving the need for us to have much better visibility in the end-to-end system and increased demand forecast accuracy. And I think this is the point of the control tower. The control tower enables us to get visibility outside of the four walls of the organization, upstream and downstream, so that we can manage and improve our demand responsiveness, our demand agility, even add to demand forecast accuracy with the right applications, because remember, a control tower is not there to improve demand forecast accuracy. I mean, you still need planning systems to do that. But in a case where we do have an event, a stockout event or a disruption in supply, we can actually run that trade-off scenario in the control tower layer and then decide how we're going to deal with that in the planning system and then feed our decisions back. So this is not about automating the end-to-end supply chain. This is about automating those processes that today are, let's say, very fragmented and siloed. It's about raising the visibility up to one end-to-end process layer and then being able to intervene manually on a planning basis if we need to intervene. So this is not just about building an automation layer. This is about a combination of people, process, and technology.
Yeah. Well, I see we're quite a bit over time, Athena. Is it time now we wrap up and say thank you to all of the participants, I think.